You're a useless person. When are you paying my rent?
In the heart of our town stood a compound of 12 small houses ruled by a woman whose name alone made grown men tremble. Mrs. Adeline Okoro owned these homes, and she wore her cruelty like a crown. On this particular morning, her voice rang across the courtyard like thunder, cursing a young tenant who dared ask for a receipt. "You worthless fool!" she screamed, her finger stabbing the air. "I will bury you! I will destroy your entire family!" The neighbors watched from behind curtains, their hearts heavy with familiar fear. For 15 years, Adeline had reigned this way, collecting rent and cash, keeping no records, raising prices without warning, and throwing out anyone who questioned her. She drove a gleaming black SUV and wore expensive jewelry to church every Sunday, where she sat in the front row, nodding piously during sermons about charity. But in her compound, she was a different creature entirely. Tenants whispered of beatings, of stolen deposits, of people dragged to police stations on false charges of theft or assault. And always the officers sided with her. Money flowed like water into their palms. No one ever won against Mrs. Okoro. No one ever dared try anymore. Until the day a quiet woman named Grace arrived, carrying a single suitcase and asking about the vacant room in the back. Adeline looked her up and down, worn shoes, faded dress, soft voice, and smiled her predator's smile. "Cash only," she said. "No receipts, my rules, take it or leave it." Grace simply nodded and moved in that afternoon. The compound held its breath, waiting. Grace was different from the others, though no one could say exactly how. She was perhaps 40 years old, with calm eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. She worked as a seamstress, her small sewing machine humming late into the night. She greeted everyone kindly, offered to mend torn clothes for free, and never complained about anything. When Adeline raised the rent without notice after just 2 weeks, Grace paid without argument. When the landlady accused her of using too much water, Grace apologized and promised to be more careful. The other tenants pitied her. "Another sheep for the slaughter," old Mr. Chen whispered to his wife. They had lived there for 8 years and had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Grace seemed even more passive than they were. She never made eye contact with Adeline, never questioned anything, never stood up for herself. The landlady grew bolder, sensing weakness. She began entering Grace's room without permission, claiming she needed to inspect for damages. She criticized Grace's sewing work loudly in the courtyard, saying anyone who paid her for such terrible stitching was a fool. She accidentally kicked over Grace's water bucket, then demanded Grace clean up the mess immediately. Through it all, Grace remained quiet, obedient, almost invisible. But she was watching and remembering. Every insult, every violation, every threat, Grace absorbed them like a sponge soaking up water, her face revealing nothing. 3 months passed and Adeline's abuse escalated. She had decided Grace was the perfect victim, too weak to fight back, too poor to leave, too timid to cause trouble. One evening, the landlady stormed into Grace's room while she was working. "I'm raising your rent again," Adeline announced, hands on her broad hips. "Double what you're paying now, starting tomorrow." Grace's hand stilled on the fabric. She looked up slowly. "Mrs. Okoro, I already pay more than the law allows for this size room. Double would be—" The slap came so fast that no one saw it coming. Adeline's hand connected with Grace's cheek with a crack that echoed through the courtyard. "Don't you dare quote the law to me," the landlady shrieked. "I am the law here. You'll pay what I say, when I say it, or I'll throw you into the street like the garbage you are." Grace touched her reddening cheek, her expression unchanged. "Yes, Mrs. Okoro," she said softly. "I understand." That night, the compound buzzed with whispered conversations. Several tenants wanted to testify if Grace reported the assault, but they knew it was useless. The police station commander was Adeline's cousin, the local magistrate owed her money, the town chairman attended her church and called her a pillar of the community. Grace had no family, no connections, no power. She was alone against a monster. But as Grace lay in her small bed that night, she wasn't thinking about helplessness. She was thinking about justice and how it sometimes wears the most unexpected faces. The next morning brought another storm. Adeline appeared at Grace's door at dawn, banging furiously. "Where is my gold bracelet?" she screamed. "I left it in the bathroom yesterday and now it's gone. You stole it, you thief!" Grace stood in her doorway, still in her nightclothes, blinking in confusion. "Mrs. Okoro, I haven't been in the main bathroom. I used the one in my room." "Liar!" Adeline's face twisted with rage. "Everyone knows seamstresses are thieves. You took it to sell. I'm calling the police." Within an hour, 2 officers arrived, friends of the landlady, grinning as they questioned Grace. They searched her room, turning everything upside down, breaking her sewing machine in the process. They found nothing, of course, because Grace had stolen nothing. But Adeline wasn't finished. "She must have hidden it somewhere," the landlady insisted. "I want her arrested anyway for trespassing in my private bathroom." The officers exchanged glances. Even by their corrupt standards, this was too much. "Madam, we found nothing," one said carefully. "We cannot arrest her without evidence." Adeline's eyes narrowed dangerously. These men had taken her money for years. They would obey her now. "Then make some evidence," she hissed quietly. The officers hesitated, but before they could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned. Grace stood calmly, her phone raised. "I've been recording everything since you arrived. Every word, every illegal search, every threat. Should I send this to the regional police commander now, or would you gentlemen prefer to leave peacefully?"
The silence that followed was absolute. The officers' faces drained of color. In this region, recordings of police corruption had recently led to several high-profile arrests. The regional commander was known for his zero-tolerance policy. He'd imprisoned his own brother for taking bribes. Adeline recovered first, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Grace, darling, there's been a misunderstanding. I found my bracelet. It was in my other bag all along. I'm so sorry." But her eyes promised murder. The officers retreated quickly, muttering about other calls to attend to. As their vehicle disappeared down the road, Adeline stepped close to Grace, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you're clever? You think that little recording protects you? I will crush you so completely that people will forget you ever existed. I know people who make problems disappear, permanently." Grace met her gaze steadily. "Is that another threat I should record, Mrs. Okoro?" For the first time in 15 years, Adeline Okoro felt a flutter of uncertainty. This woman wasn't what she seemed. But the landlady had destroyed stronger people than Grace before. This was just a temporary setback. That afternoon, Adeline made phone calls to every landlord in town, spreading lies about Grace, that she was a thief, a troublemaker, mentally unstable. She wanted to ensure that when she finally evicted Grace, the woman would have nowhere else to go. But what Adeline didn't know was that Grace was making phone calls too, and the people Grace called were far more dangerous to Adeline than the landlady could possibly imagine. Word of the confrontation spread through the compound like wildfire. For the first time in years, tenants dared to hope. That evening, young Maria from House 7 knocked softly on Grace's door. "Miss Grace, thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Last year, Mrs. Okoro accused me of the same thing, stealing her ring. She made me pay her 3 months' rent as compensation, even though I never touched it. She does this to everyone eventually. Old Mr. Chen came next, then the carpenter from House 3, then the nurse from House 9. One by one, they shared their stories. Stolen deposits, fabricated damages, threats and violence, false police reports, a young man who'd been beaten so badly he'd spent a week in hospital, and then Adeline had somehow convinced the police to arrest him for attacking her. They all had scars, but no evidence. Adeline always made sure there were no witnesses she couldn't control, no records she couldn't destroy. She ruled through fear and careful calculation. But Grace listened to every story, taking notes on her phone, asking gentle questions. When had it happened? Who else was there? Were there any records, receipts, hospital reports? The tenants shared what little they had. Finally, Grace spoke. Mrs. Okoro believes she's untouchable because of her connections, but every fortress has a weakness. We just need to find hers. What can we do? Maria asked desperately. We have no money for lawyers. No one important will listen to us. Grace smiled, a small, mysterious smile. Children, I wasn't always a seamstress. I've lived many lives, learned many things, and I've learned this. Bullies like Adeline have one fatal flaw. They become so confident in their power that they stop being careful.
The next 2 weeks were deceptively quiet. Grace continued her seamstress work, remaining polite and submissive whenever Adeline appeared. But behind this mask, she was weaving a different kind of thread, one that would eventually bind the landlady in her own lies. Grace had learned something valuable from her old life before poverty and tragedy had brought her low. Powerful people always leave trails. They believe they're too important to face consequences, so they become careless. She began with public records at the city office. Adeline's property wasn't properly registered. The landlady had been collecting rent for 15 years without declaring the income for taxes. Grace documented everything, taking photos with her phone. Next, she visited the hospital where the beaten tenant had been treated. The records were still there, evidence of injuries inconsistent with his supposed attack on Adeline. She obtained copies, legally, claiming she was a family friend gathering information for an insurance claim. She contacted the regional housing authority with anonymous tips about illegal rental practices. They couldn't act immediately, but they began a file. Grace also did something else, something that revealed the depths of her hidden experience. She researched Adeline's past, going back decades, through old newspapers and property records, and there, buried in archives from 25 years ago, she found it, the source of Adeline's wealth and the secret that would ultimately destroy her. A young woman named Adeline Mbeki had married a wealthy elderly man, Victor Okoro. 6 months later, Victor died suddenly. His children from his first marriage had contested the will, claiming his father had been coerced, possibly poisoned, but the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence. Grace took her findings to a lawyer, not a local one, but someone from the capital city who owed her a debt from her previous life. She'd once helped his mother with a legal problem, asking nothing in return. Now she was calling in that favor. The lawyer, Mr. Adeleke, reviewed the documents with increasing interest. "This is explosive," he said quietly. "If we can prove she's been illegally collecting rent, evading taxes, and falsifying police reports, she'll face serious charges. But the old inheritance case, that's dangerous territory. Without new evidence, it's just suspicion." "I understand," said Grace. "I'm not trying to convict her of murder. I just need leverage, something to make her powerful friends abandon her when the time comes." Mr. Adeleke nodded slowly. "You're playing a dangerous game. If she discovers what you're doing before you're ready—" "She won't," Grace interrupted gently. "She's too busy enjoying her cruelty to notice the trap closing around her." That night, Adeline proved Grace right. The landlady had grown frustrated with Grace's continued presence. The quiet seamstress should have been broken by now, should have fled in terror, or at least given Adeline an excuse to evict her. Instead, Grace remained calm, polite, and somehow untouchable. It infuriated Adeline beyond reason, so she decided to escalate. At midnight, Adeline crept to Grace's window and poured gasoline along the base of the wall, then lit a small fire. Not enough to kill anyone, she wasn't quite ready for murder, but enough to terrify, to destroy belongings, to force Grace to flee. But Adeline had made a critical error. Grace's window faced the courtyard, and 3 other tenants saw everything.
The fire was small and quickly extinguished, but the damage was done. Not to Grace's room, but to Adeline's carefully constructed immunity. Mr. Chen had filmed the entire incident on his phone. The video clearly showed Adeline's face in the courtyard lights, the gasoline can in her hand, the deliberate lighting of the fire. It was irrefutable evidence of arson and attempted murder. By morning, Adeline knew she'd been recorded. Mr. Chen, emboldened by Grace's earlier courage, had confronted her directly. "Delete that video or I'll destroy you," Adeline screamed, lunging at the old man. But this time, other tenants intervened, physically blocking her. Something had shifted in the compound. The spell of fear was breaking. Adeline retreated to her main house, shaking with rage and, for the first time, fear. She called her police contacts immediately. "I need that old man arrested," she demanded. "He assaulted me. He's making false accusations." But the officer on the line hesitated. "Madam, we heard about the fire. If there's video evidence, the regional commander has been asking questions about complaints from your compound. Perhaps it would be better if we stayed away from this situation." Adeline slammed down the phone, her mind racing. Her protection was crumbling. She needed to act decisively, to crush this rebellion before it spread further. She made another call, this time to a man whose services were darker and more final than police corruption. But Grace had anticipated this move too. That afternoon, a sleek government vehicle pulled into the compound. 3 serious-looking officials emerged, representatives from the Regional Housing Authority, Tax Office, and Police Internal Affairs Division. "Mrs. Adeline Okakoro?" the lead official asked formally. "We have some questions about your rental properties and business practices." Adeline's heart hammered, but she forced a smile. Of course. Please come inside. This must be a misunderstanding." For 2 hours, they questioned her about property registration, tax returns, rental agreements, and tenant complaints. Adeline lied smoothly, presenting fake receipts she'd quickly forged, claiming all her tenants were happy, suggesting that any complaints came from mentally disturbed individuals trying to extort money. But the officials were thorough. They asked to see the original property documents. When Adeline produced them, a sharp-eyed inspector noticed discrepancies in the deed, areas where the property boundaries had been altered to include land she didn't legally own. They asked about specific tenants who'd filed complaints. When Adeline claimed these people had never lived there, they produced rental records they'd obtained from utility companies, proving she was lying. Slowly, methodically, they dismantled her web of deception. As the officials prepared to leave, the lead inspector turned back. "Mrs. Okakoro, we'll be conducting a formal investigation. Please don't leave town, and we'll need you to cease all rental collections until this is resolved." After they left, Adeline stood alone in her lavish living room, decorated with furniture bought with stolen deposits and unpaid taxes, and felt the walls closing in. How had this happened? That quiet, worthless seamstress couldn't have orchestrated this, could she? That evening, Adeline's most reliable police contact called with worse news. "Ma, I can't help you anymore. The regional commander himself is reviewing files from your compound. My own position is at risk. I'm sorry."
One by one, her protections fell away. Her allies in government suddenly became too busy to take her calls. Grace sat in her small room, the broken sewing machine now repaired by the grateful carpenter, and allowed herself a small smile. Everything was proceeding as planned. But she took no joy in Adeline's suffering, only satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The other tenants had begun to view Grace with awe and curiosity. Who was this woman, really? How had she orchestrated such a perfect collapse of Adeline's empire? That evening, young Maria worked up the courage to ask, "Miss Grace, forgive me, but you're not just a seamstress, are you?" Grace set down her sewing and looked at the young woman kindly. "I am a seamstress now, child, but you're right, I wasn't always. Once I was a lawyer, specializing in housing rights and tenant protection. I worked in the Capitol for 20 years. The gathered tenants gasped. Grace continued softly. 5 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I trusted the wrong person, signed papers I shouldn't have, and lost everything. My practice, my reputation, my home. I fell far and hard. When I arrived here, I was truly as helpless as I appeared. But helpless doesn't mean powerless, and losing everything taught me something valuable. The law still exists, even when we can't afford lawyers. Rights still exist, even when we're too frightened to claim them." Mr. Chen shook his head in wonder. "But why come here? Why endure Adeline's abuse when you could have—" "Because running from bullies doesn't stop them," Grace interrupted gently. "They just find new victims. I came here because I heard about Mrs. Okoro, about her cruelty, and I decided someone needed to stand against her. Not with violence or revenge, but with the one thing she couldn't buy or intimidate, the truth." But Grace's revelation had reached the wrong ears. One of Adeline's few remaining loyalists, a tenant named Paul, who'd been reporting on the others, immediately told the landlady everything. Adeline's fear transformed into cold fury. A lawyer! This whole time she'd been toying with a lawyer who'd been building a case against her. The humiliation burned worse than any legal threat. That night, Adeline made her most desperate and dangerous decision. She contacted a man named Femi, known in certain circles for solving problems that the law couldn't touch. "I want her gone," Adeline said coldly. "I don't care how. Make it look like an accident." Femi named a price, steep, but Adeline didn't hesitate. She'd accumulated enough wealth to afford whatever was necessary. But Femi had a problem. He'd been under surveillance for weeks as part of an unrelated investigation. When he met with Adeline in a dark parking lot to accept the payment and discuss the plan, plainclothes officers recorded everything. By dawn, both Femi and Adeline were in custody. The charge, conspiracy to commit murder. Grace received the news while drinking morning tea, surrounded by relieved tenants. She set down her cup carefully, her hand trembling slightly, not from satisfaction, but from the sobering reality of how close she'd come to death. "I didn't want it to go this far," she told Mr. Chen quietly. "I hoped she would simply be forced to follow the law, to treat people fairly. But people like Adeline can't accept anything less than total domination. When they start losing power, they become desperate, dangerous." The next weeks unfolded like a house of cards collapsing. The murder-for-hire charge was serious enough that Adeline's bail was denied. While in custody, investigators dug deeper into her finances, her property holdings, her history. The old case of her husband's death was reopened when an anonymous tip, provided by Grace through her lawyer, led investigators to a nurse who'd been present during Victor Okoro's final days. The nurse, now elderly and terminally ill herself, decided to clear her conscience. She testified that Adeline had slowly poisoned her husband, disguising it as deteriorating health from age. The nurse had suspected, but been too frightened to speak at the time. Now, with nothing left to lose, she provided detailed testimony. Meanwhile, the tax office calculated Adeline's unpaid taxes over 15 years of illegal rental income. The sum was staggering, more than she currently possessed, even after selling everything. The housing authority filed charges for operating unregistered rental properties, for illegal evictions, for fraud. Former tenants came forward with stories of abuse, emboldened by Adeline's imprisonment. The carpenter testified about the beating that had hospitalized him. Maria provided evidence of the fake theft accusation. Mr. Chen's video of the arson attempt was submitted as evidence. Piece by piece, the full scope of Adeline's cruelty was revealed. But the most devastating revelation came from Adeline's own family, Victor Okoro's children, who'd been silenced 25 years ago. When they learned of the reopened case, they came forward with letters their father had written before his death, expressing fear of his new wife, saying he'd changed his will back to favor his children. Those letters had disappeared during the original investigation, likely destroyed by Adeline's corrupt police contacts. But the children had kept copies, hidden away, waiting for justice. Now they finally had their chance. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Adeline's expensive lawyers argued, negotiated, and maneuvered, but the evidence was too substantial, too well documented, too public. The trial became regional news. Reporters filled the courtroom, fascinated by the story of the cruel landlady and the quiet seamstress who'd brought her down. Grace attended every day, sitting in the back, saying nothing, her presence alone a reminder of why they were there. Adeline, for her part, remained defiant throughout the trial. She shouted at witnesses, accused Grace of being a witch who'd cursed her, claimed she was the victim of a vast conspiracy. But her rage only reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of her as someone whose cruelty knew no bounds. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous on all counts: murder, attempted murder, arson, fraud, tax evasion, and multiple counts of assault. The judge, a stern woman who'd heard every detail of Adeline's decades of abuse, showed no mercy. Mrs. Okoro, you were given power through your marriage to Mr. Victor Okoro, power that came with the responsibility to honor his memory and treat others with dignity. Instead, you murdered him for his wealth, then spent 25 years terrorizing the vulnerable. You showed no mercy to those beneath you, so this court shall show you no mercy now. The sentence: 25 years in prison for the murder, with additional consecutive sentences for the other crimes. At age 57, Adeline would be over 80 before she saw freedom again, if she lived that long. As guards led her away, Adeline locked eyes with Grace one final time. In that moment, the landlady's defiance crumbled, replaced by something Grace recognized: the terrible understanding that she'd destroyed herself through her own choices, that pride, greed, and cruelty always, eventually, meet their reckoning.
With Adeline imprisoned and her property seized by the government to pay restitution, the compound underwent a transformation. The housing authority appointed a proper management company to oversee the properties until they could be sold. Rents dropped to legal levels, deposits were properly documented, repairs that had been neglected for years were finally completed. But the real transformation was in the people themselves. Young Maria enrolled in evening classes to finish her education, no longer exhausted from the constant stress of Adeline's abuse. Mr. Chen's health improved dramatically. His doctor said the reduction in daily anxiety had helped his heart condition. The carpenter expanded his business, taking on apprentices. One by one, the tenants who'd been trapped by fear and poverty began to rebuild their lives. Grace, meanwhile, quietly filed paperwork to reclaim her legal license. Her redemption had come not through wealth or status, but through using her knowledge to help others. The Bar Association, impressed by her pro bono work in exposing Adeline's crimes, accelerated her reinstatement. Several months after the trial, Grace opened a small legal clinic in town, specializing in tenant rights and housing issues. She charged nothing for those who couldn't pay, and modest fees for those who could. Word spread quickly. The lawyer who defeated Adeline Okoro was now helping others facing similar situations. People came from neighboring towns, carrying stories of corrupt landlords, illegal evictions, stolen deposits. Grace took every case seriously, building careful documentation, following proper legal channels, never resorting to shortcuts or revenge. She taught her clients that justice was slow but certain, that rights existed even when they were violated, that power could always be challenged by truth.